What if I told you that in one remote mountain valley, 94 fighters died in 7 days, and almost no one could figure out where the shots were coming from? No visible sniper, no clear firing position, just a single sharp crack echoing through the cliffs, followed by another body on the ground. Some survivors later claimed the sound didn't come from one direction. They said it came from everywhere at once, from the rocks, from the caves, from the valley walls themselves. Imagine standing guard in a place like that. You're holding your weapon, your entire unit is around you, and suddenly someone drops, but nobody can point to where the shot came from. No muzzle flash, no movement, just silence. Now here's the strange part. According to scattered reports and testimonies from people who studied the incident, the man believed to be responsible didn't rely on advanced technology or experimental weapons. Instead, he may have used something far older, the landscape itself, cliffs, echoes, and carefully placed stones that could bend sound across an entire canyon. So the real question is this: can a battlefield be turned into a weapon just by understanding how sound moves through it? Because if that's true, then what happened in that valley might change the way we think about warfare forever. But before we get into the full story, I want to ask you something. If you were a soldier standing in that valley and the mountains suddenly started echoing gunshots from every direction, what would you do? Would you stay and fight, or would you run? Type "fight" or "run" in the comments right now. I'm genuinely curious how people would react in a situation like that. Tell me, have you ever noticed how strange silence can feel? Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that makes the back of your neck tighten, like something is watching. Now imagine being a soldier standing guard in a remote mountain valley, rifle in your hands, scanning the horizon, and hearing absolutely nothing. No wind, no movement, no warning. Then suddenly, a man next to you drops. No gunshot, no flash, just silence. So here's the question once again in simple words I want you to think about while watching this story. Could silence itself become the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield? Because according to several military accounts from the war in Afghanistan, there was one operation where that idea might have become terrifyingly real. A mission whispered about among soldiers, sometimes called Silent Canyon. And according to reports, during one brutal week in the mountains, dozens of enemy fighters were taken out by a sniper no one could hear and no one could find. But before we dive into this strange and controversial story, I'm curious about something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country or city in the comments. It's always fascinating seeing how far these stories travel around the world. All right, let's get into it. The official military record describes the event as a routine counterinsurgency operation in eastern Afghanistan during the fall of 2007. But the details behind the mission are still debated. Public reports mention scattered firefights and a successful clearing operation in a mountain valley used by insurgent forces. However, some former soldiers who were involved in the region have hinted that the reality of what happened there was far stranger. After-action notes, soldier testimonies, and fragments of intelligence reports suggest that something unusual unfolded inside that valley, something that caused panic among fighters who believed they were safely fortified. Some even began referring to the place as the Valley of Whispers. And strangely enough, the story doesn't begin in Afghanistan at all. It begins thousands of miles away, in the deserts of New Mexico. There, a boy named Thomas Blackwater grew up listening to stories from his grandfather. But these weren't just legends, they were lessons. Lessons about patience, about moving quietly through harsh landscapes, about understanding the sounds and the silences of nature. According to people who knew him later, Blackwater had an unusual ability to stay perfectly still for long periods of time. Friends joked that he could sit in the desert for hours without moving, but to him it wasn't a trick, it was training. Training passed down through generations who survived by blending into the land around them. Years later, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, Blackwater joined the United States Marine Corps. He was 19, and during training, instructors quickly noticed something different about him. One report described him as having an unusually calm presence under pressure. Another instructor purportedly wrote that he had a rare ability to observe before acting. In other words, he didn't rush, he watched, he waited, and when he acted, he was precise. By the mid-2000s, Blackwater had already completed multiple deployments. He had built a reputation among his peers as a highly skilled designated marksman. But interestingly, his reputation wasn't based on numbers, it was based on how he operated. Enemy fighters who were taken out by him were often discovered in strange circumstances, weapons still in their hands, positions unchanged, almost as if they never realized anyone was there. Which brings us to the mission that would later become the center of this story. In October of 2007, coalition forces were dealing with a serious problem in a narrow mountain region in eastern Afghanistan. A heavily armed insurgent group had fortified itself inside a valley that controlled several important supply routes. Attempts to remove them had gone badly. Helicopters had taken fire, ground assaults had suffered heavy resistance, and the terrain made everything harder. The valley itself was surrounded by steep limestone cliffs rising hundreds of feet into the air. From above, the place looked like a natural fortress. But the strangest feature of the valley wasn't the cliffs. It was the acoustics. Soldiers reported that sound behaved oddly there. Voices echoed in unexpected ways. Footsteps seemed to come from the wrong direction, and sometimes a single noise could bounce around the rock walls until it sounded like it came from everywhere at once. Local villagers had actually avoided the valley for generations. Some believed it was haunted. Others simply said the mountains played tricks on the ears. Military planners studying the region realized something important. If someone understood how sound moved inside that valley, they might be able to use it. And that's where Sergeant Blackwater entered the conversation. He was given time to study maps, geological surveys, and old field reports about the terrain. One document in particular caught his attention, a decades-old anthropological study written by a British researcher who had traveled through Afghan mountain villages in the 1960s. In the journal, the researcher described a technique used by shepherds. They placed small stones around certain rock formations to redirect sound. The locals called them singing stones. A tiny sound made in one spot could echo through the valley from several directions at once. To animals, and sometimes even to people, it sounded like multiple voices. Blackwater reportedly spent hours studying that concept. Maps spread across the table, markers circling the valley walls, and slowly, a plan began forming. It wasn't a typical military strategy. In fact, when his commanding officer reviewed the proposal, the reaction was reportedly mixed. The document was only a few pages long, but the final section described an approach that relied less on firepower and more on manipulating the terrain itself. Eventually, the mission moved forward. In the early hours of October 9th, under the cover of darkness, Blackwater was inserted into the mountains. He carried a suppressed rifle, climbing gear, supplies, and something that seemed almost strange for a military operation, a small pack filled with smooth river stones. No large team, no constant radio updates, just a limited time window to operate. For 2 full days, nothing happened. Observation teams watching from distant ridges reported no visible activity. Inside the valley, insurging fighters continued their routines, unaware that someone might already be moving along the cliffs above them. Then, on the morning of October 11th, the first body was discovered. A guard posted on the eastern side of the valley had been killed by a single shot. The angle of the wound suggested the shooter had fired from high above, but when the fighters searched the surrounding rock face, they found nothing. No sniper, no footprints, no sign of movement. 30 minutes later, it happened again. Another sentry, on the opposite side of the valley, nearly half a mile away. Same wound, same mysterious angle. At that point, confusion started spreading through the camp. Some fighters believed a drone strike system was targeting them. Others thought there were multiple snipers hidden in the cliffs, but no matter where they searched, they couldn't find anyone. Over the next several days, more incidents followed, and according to reconstructed reports from the aftermath, a pattern slowly emerged. Someone high in the cliffs had begun using the valley itself almost like a giant acoustic instrument. At night, they moved across dangerous climbing routes, carefully placing stones in certain crevices, redirecting echoes, changing how sound traveled through the canyon. By sunrise, the positions were ready, and when a shot was finally fired, the echo didn't reveal the shooter's location. Instead, the mountains answered from everywhere at once. So how did one sniper manage to stay invisible for so long? The answer wasn't just skill with a rifle, it was patience and something far stranger. Each morning, Sergeant Blackwater would settle into a new firing position somewhere along the towering limestone cliffs. Sometimes the spot was hundreds of yards away from where he had worked the night before. Then he would wait, sometimes for hours, until eventually a target stepped into view. When the shot came, the suppressed rifle produced only a short, sharp crack, barely louder than a dry branch snapping in the forest. But inside that valley, the sound never behaved normally. The carefully placed stones redirected the echo in strange directions. To the fighters below, the noise didn't sound like a single gunshot. It sounded like many gunshots. Some later said the sound seemed to come from inside their own bunkers. Others swore the crack came from high above them in the sky, and a few claimed it echoed from somewhere deep in the mountains themselves. During interrogations months later, one captured fighter described the experience in chilling terms. "We were fighting a ghost," he said. The translator who recorded the conversation noted something unusual. The prisoner kept glancing behind him, even though he was sitting inside a guarded room, as if he still expected the unseen sniper to be there. Think about that for a second. How do you fight an enemy you can't locate, can't hear, and can't predict? That psychological pressure started spreading through the camp. By October 13th, reports suggested that more than a dozen fighters had already been killed by precise daytime shots. Every one of them struck in the head. Every one of them taken down while surrounded by other armed men. Soon the fear became impossible to ignore. Guards refused to stand watch alone. Patrols began cutting their routes short. Some soldiers claimed they could hear footsteps in empty areas of the valley. Others said they heard faint clicking sounds moving through the rocks. 3 fighters reportedly abandoned their weapons and fled into the surrounding mountains entirely. The unit's commander tried to restore discipline the only way he knew how: force. He ordered a public execution of 2 men accused of cowardice. The entire force was assembled in the middle of the valley to witness it. The idea was simple: fear the commander more than the unseen enemy. But what happened next only made things worse. Just as the commander raised his pistol to carry out the execution, a single crack echoed through the valley. The commander collapsed instantly. The prisoner standing beside him survived. Imagine what that moment must have felt like. An entire armed unit watching their leader fall without seeing where the shot came from. After that, the situation inside the valley began to collapse. Groups scattered. Fighters retreated into caves and tunnels carved into the mountainside. They covered entrances with camouflage nets and debris. Some refused to move during daylight at all. Instead, they waited for darkness, hoping the sniper relied on daylight visibility. But according to later reconstructions of the operation, Blackwater had anticipated those moves. He had studied not just the geography of the valley, but the psychology of hunted men. Where they would run, where they would hide, where fear would push them. And he had already prepared positions that overlooked many of those routes. Because the stone ecosystem wasn't just about hiding his location, it was about turning the entire valley into something unsettling, something unpredictable, something that made the enemy question every sound they heard. One captured fighter later described a moment that still disturbed him years later. He and 11 others had taken shelter in a cave complex on the southern side of the valley. They had supplies, food, water, and thick rock walls for protection. They believed the sniper would eventually give up and leave. On the fourth night, they heard a small sound outside the entrance, just a faint clink, like a pebble hitting stone. Then, silence. They waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, one of the men, Abdul, decided to check outside. The others warned him not to go, but he stepped toward the entrance anyway. A shot rang out. Abdul fell backward into the cave, dead. But what unsettled the survivors most wasn't just the shot, it was where they believed it came from. To them, the sound seemed to originate inside the cave itself, behind them, which made no sense. Marine investigators later concluded that the shot likely came from outside the entrance at a sharp angle, while the echoing acoustics made it appear to originate deeper within the cave system. But by that point, logic no longer mattered. Fear had taken over. By October 15th, the once organized force inside the valley had effectively broken apart. Reports later estimated that dozens of fighters had been killed during the week. Many others deserted or surrendered to nearby Afghan government forces, and the rest disappeared into the mountains. When the extraction window finally arrived, Blackwater activated his emergency beacon. A helicopter picked him up several miles from the valley. The pilot who flew the mission later described the sniper as exhausted, thin, quiet, and looking far older than he had a week earlier. He wasn't injured, but he had fired nearly every round he carried. Back at Bagram Airfield, an after-action debriefing was conducted behind closed doors. According to later reports, several officers, intelligence analysts, and a military psychologist were present. Portions of the discussion were later referenced by investigative journalists years later. During the briefing, one officer asked a simple question. "Sergeant Blackwater, can you explain how you managed the operation?" The room reportedly fell silent for several seconds. Blackwater looked down at his hands before answering. Then he said something unusual. "I didn't fight the valley," he explained. "I listened to it." He went on to describe the operation not as a display of marksmanship, but as a process of understanding the terrain. How sound moved. How the cliffs redirected echoes. How the landscape itself could influence perception. The psychologist present during the interview later recommended a short observation period for combat stress, but the recommendation was never formally acted on. Blackwater returned to duty soon after. For the military, the mission had been a tactical success, but the story didn't end there. In the months that followed, strange rumors began circulating among nearby Afghan villages. Shepherds reportedly avoided certain parts of the mountains. Some villagers claimed that echoes carried unusually far at night. Others said the rocks themselves seemed to whisper when the wind moved through the valley. Now, whether those reports were simply rumors, trauma, or local folklore is impossible to confirm, but they added another layer of mystery to the story. And one question that still lingers: was this operation simply a brilliant example of tactical adaptation? Or did the strange acoustics of that valley create something far more unsettling? What do you think? Could one person really manipulate sound in a mountain valley like that? Or do you think some of these stories grew larger over time as soldiers and villagers tried to make sense of a terrifying experience? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to see what you think. And if you want to hear more real military stories, strange battlefield tactics, and forgotten operations from history, make sure you stick around, because the next story might be even stranger. After the events in the valley, most people assumed the story was over. Mission complete. Enemy position cleared. Operation closed. But for one military intelligence analyst, the story had only just begun. Her name was Captain Jennifer Morrison, and her job involved something many people don't think about when it comes to warfare. Not weapons, not tactics, but psychological impact. More specifically, Morrison monitored what the military calls blowback, situations where psychological warfare tactics used against enemy forces start affecting civilians or spreading unexpected fear in surrounding regions. And in late 2007, reports from villages near the valley began landing on her desk. At first, they seemed like isolated rumors, stories of strange echoes in the mountains, villagers claiming that certain valleys produced unsettling sounds at night, children waking up from nightmares about voices calling their names from the hills. Individually, none of these reports meant much, but Morrison started noticing something unusual. When she compared the locations of these reports, a pattern appeared. Years later, during a closed intelligence briefing referenced by investigative journalists, Morrison explained what caught her attention. She said the incidents followed a trail that appeared to match the deployment history of one particular Marine sniper, Sergeant Thomas Blackwater. Now, officially, Morrison wasn't assigned to investigate him, so the research she began doing happened during her own time. Late nights, cross-checking operational reports, reading interrogation transcripts, looking for anything that mentioned unusual battlefield behavior. What she discovered surprised her, because the stories didn't begin in Afghanistan. They went back further. The earliest case she found was from Iraq in 2006, during Blackwater's second deployment. A Marine unit had been pinned down by fighters inside a heavily fortified building in the city of Ramadi. The structure was reinforced, and the insurgents inside had a clear advantage. Normally, the solution would have been overwhelming force, air support, or armored vehicles. Instead, the company commander requested specialized sniper support. 3 days earlier, Blackwater had been attached to the unit. The official report was brief and professional. Enemy position neutralized. Minimal damage to surrounding buildings. No Marine casualties. But Morrison found something unusual in an interrogation transcript from a captured fighter. The man claimed to be one of the only survivors inside the building. His account sounded bizarre. According to the report, he kept repeating the same phrase during questioning. The building was screaming. At first, interrogators thought he was exaggerating or disoriented, but he insisted that strange sounds echoed through the structure during the firefight. Voices calling out directions, sounds bouncing through walls, echoes that made it impossible to tell where the sniper was actually positioned. He claimed that at one point, fighters inside the building began firing in the wrong directions, even at each other, because they believed enemy soldiers had somehow entered the building without being seen. The interrogator's notes described the man as extremely agitated. At one point, he reportedly said, "The building knew we were there." Now, obviously, that statement doesn't mean the building was literally alive, but to someone trapped inside during an intense firefight, confusing echoes could easily create the feeling that the environment itself was working against them. Morrison kept digging. Over the next several weeks, she located 7 additional incidents. Different locations, different battles, but the same strange detail appearing again and again. Enemy fighters describing unusual sound patterns, voices echoing in unexpected ways, gunshots that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. And each case had one common factor. Sergeant Blackwater had been present. But the 8th case was the one that truly unsettled her, because it involved a place where echoes behave very differently: underground tunnels. In early 2007, Blackwater had briefly been attached to a task force operating in Iraq's Anbar province. The unit was attempting to eliminate an insurgent cell hiding inside a complex network of tunnels. Multiple attempts to clear the tunnels had already failed. The fighters inside knew the layout too well. Every entrance was defended. Every approach had been anticipated. So the task force commander accepted an unusual request. Instead of sending a full assault team again, one operator would enter first: Blackwater. According to operational summaries, he entered the tunnel system alone just before nightfall. The extraction window was scheduled for dawn. No continuous radio contact, no backup team following behind, just one person moving through miles of underground passages. When morning arrived, Blackwater walked back out of the entrance. The tunnel network had gone completely silent. A clearing team entered the complex expecting heavy resistance. Instead, they found something disturbing: multiple fighters dead, but not positioned for combat. Some had been running. Others had collapsed in narrow passages. A few appeared to have been trying to escape deeper into the tunnels. Forensic analysis later suggested several deaths were caused by extreme stress or panic during the chaos. Only one man survived. He was found unconscious after apparently hitting his head while fleeing through the darkness. When he woke up, witnesses reported that he began screaming uncontrollably. The outburst lasted for hours before he was sedated. During the moments when he was calm enough to speak, he repeated one sentence over and over in Arabic: "The stones have mouths." Now again, that doesn't mean anything supernatural actually happened, but inside an underground tunnel system where every sound echoes unpredictably, even small noises can bounce through passages in confusing ways. Morrison wanted to ask Blackwater directly about these incidents, but when she requested an interview, she was told he was unavailable due to ongoing operations, so she made a decision that would end up costing her the investigation. She filed a formal intelligence request. The request asked for a deeper psychological evaluation of Blackwater and a review of the unusual reports connected to his missions. 3 days later, 2 men arrived at her office. They weren't in uniform. They identified themselves as contractors connected to a Department of Defense program. According to Morrison's later account, they collected every file related to her investigation: research notes, reports, computer records. Then they informed her that continuing the investigation would violate national security restrictions. 2 weeks later, she was reassigned to a logistics post in Kuwait. Officially, the case was closed. But outside the military, someone else had begun asking similar questions: a freelance war journalist named Webb. Webb had spent years reporting from Iraq and Afghanistan and had developed contacts on both sides of the conflict. During interviews with former fighters who had later left the war, he kept hearing the same strange rumor. Stories about a sniper who seemed impossible to track. Stories about battles where the environment itself appeared to confuse soldiers. Eventually, Webb tracked down several former Taliban fighters living in Europe. He interviewed them separately in different countries, and according to his notes, their descriptions of the Valley incident were remarkably similar. But one claim in particular caught his attention. They said that after the operation ended, coalition forces returned to the valley, not to collect weapons, not to retrieve bodies, but to examine the rocks themselves. One of the former fighters told Webb during an interview in Germany, they searched the cliffs for days, removing certain stones from certain places. According to villagers watching from a distance, helicopters arrived carrying equipment. Teams worked along the rock walls in careful grid patterns, almost like they were mapping the terrain or removing something specific. When Webb asked the Department of Defense about the claim, officials denied that any unusual operation had taken place, but Webb later obtained commercial satellite imagery from the period following the mission. The images showed helicopters entering and leaving the valley multiple times, teams moving across the cliffs in systematic patterns, and small demolition charges used to collapse sections of caves. Webb eventually published his investigation in a European magazine in 2009. The article didn't claim anything supernatural had happened, but it asked a question that still lingers today. Did one soldier simply use the terrain better than anyone before him, or had he discovered something about the way sound behaves in those mountains that most people never notice? And that raises another question I want to ask you. If someone truly understood how echoes move through valleys, tunnels, and cliffs, do you think it could actually change the outcome of a battle? Or do you think these stories grew more dramatic over time as rumors spread among soldiers and villagers? Drop your thoughts below, because the final part of this story might raise even more questions than answers. When Marcus Webb's investigation was finally published in Europe in 2009, it didn't cause a huge reaction in the United States. At that time, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had already been going on for years. For many people back home, news from the battlefield had slowly faded into background noise. But one person did notice the article. Dr. Sarah Chen, an anthropology professor at the University of New Mexico. Her research specialty was unusual: the history of indigenous warfare techniques and how traditional knowledge sometimes reappears in modern conflicts. For more than a decade, she had studied the military traditions of Apache warriors in the American Southwest. So when she read Webb's description of stones arranged in specific formations and how those stones could redirect sound through narrow valleys, she immediately recognized something. During a lecture several years later, Dr. Chen explained why the article caught her attention. According to her research, Apache warriors in the 1800s had developed an extremely detailed understanding of how terrain could influence sound and movement. Cliffs, rock formations, canyon walls, all of these could be used to confuse enemies. But Chen also mentioned something else. Certain techniques, she said, were not widely passed down through later generations, not because they didn't work, but because the elders believed they carried risks. Not physical risks, psychological ones. Chen suggested that warriors who spent years learning to interpret subtle echoes and environmental signals sometimes became hyper-aware of their surroundings. In other words, they trained their senses to pick up patterns most people normally ignore, and that heightened awareness could become overwhelming over time. Now, to be clear, historians debate how much of that idea is cultural tradition versus documented reality. But the connection between Chen's research and Webb's article was enough to make her curious. She tried contacting Sergeant Blackwater through military channels. Her requests were declined. She then planned a trip to New Mexico to speak with elders in the Mescalero Apache community about historical acoustic techniques. But according to her later statements, the research funding supporting that project suddenly disappeared. Shortly afterward, she was reportedly advised that continuing the investigation might conflict with military security interests. And just like that, the trail seemed to end. Or at least, it went quiet. Then in 2012, something unexpected appeared online. Among thousands of diplomatic cables released publicly that year was one message from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, dating back to 2007. Most of the document discussed routine security issues, but buried in one paragraph was a brief reference to complaints raised by Afghan officials. The message suggested that certain coalition operations had used psychological tactics inspired by local or tribal knowledge. The cable noted that some Afghan leaders were concerned these methods could have long-term psychological effects in areas where they were used. The document didn't mention Blackwater by name, but to the small group of researchers already following the story, the timing seemed hard to ignore. Within months of that communication, Sergeant Thomas Blackwater left the Marine Corps with an honorable discharge. After that, he essentially disappeared from public records. No verified social media, no public interviews, no traceable civilian career. Several rumors began circulating over the years. One version claimed he returned quietly to the mountains of New Mexico and chose a private life far from media attention. Another rumor suggested he had been recruited into highly classified government programs. Of course, there's no public evidence confirming either story. But there is a third theory that some researchers have discussed, and it's a far more personal one. Dr. Chen once mentioned that traditional accounts sometimes described warriors who became so attuned to environmental signals that ordinary places never felt ordinary again. Echoes sounded different, footsteps carried further. Landscapes began to feel like tactical puzzles rather than peaceful scenery. In other words, the training that once helped them survive war made it harder to fully return to normal life. Again, historians debate how literal those accounts really are, but they raise an interesting question. What happens when someone spends years studying how terrain, sound, and silence can shape human perception? Can you ever completely turn that awareness off, or does the world always sound a little different afterward? Interestingly, a small event years later added one more strange footnote to the story. In 2015, a hiker exploring a remote canyon in New Mexico reported discovering a curious arrangement of stones along a cliff wall. The rocks had been placed in a geometric pattern. When the hiker spoke, his voice bounced around the canyon in unusual ways, echoing from several directions at once. Concerned it might be some kind of archaeological site, he reported the location to the U.S. Forest Service. But when rangers visited the area 3 days later, the stones were gone. No official explanation was ever recorded. Meanwhile, the valley in Afghanistan where Operation Silent Canyon reportedly occurred remains largely abandoned. Despite its strategic location, permanent bases were never established there. Local explanations usually mention unstable terrain or limited water access, but some shepherds in nearby mountains still avoid the area. They simply say, "The place feels wrong." Whether that's folklore, lingering fear from past battles, or just the strange acoustics of the landscape is impossible to know. But every now and then, villagers claim that when the wind moves through the cliffs in a certain way, you can hear odd echoes bouncing across the rocks. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps, sometimes like stones clicking against each other, and very rarely a sharp cracking sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. Now, whether those sounds have anything to do with an old military operation, or whether they're simply the natural acoustics of the mountains, is something we may never know. But it does leave us with one final question. Was Operation Silent Canyon simply an example of brilliant battlefield adaptation, or did one soldier rediscover an ancient understanding of how the land itself can shape human perception? And more importantly, if you were standing in that valley, hearing those echoes, do you think you'd be able to stay calm? Or would the silence start to feel like something watching you? Let me know what you think. And if you enjoy exploring strange military stories, forgotten operations, and the psychology behind warfare, stick around, because sometimes the most powerful weapons in history weren't weapons at all. After publishing his investigation, journalist Marcus Webb continued looking into the story. In 2011, he traveled to Afghanistan again, hoping to gather more information about unusual battlefield tactics that had been whispered about for years. But that trip would be his last. Webb was killed in Kabul when an improvised explosive device detonated near a convoy route he was traveling along. Incidents like that were tragically common during that period of the war. With Webb gone, one of the few independent investigations into the story of Silent Canyon came to an abrupt end. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah Chen's research into traditional environmental warfare techniques also stalled. Her university eventually withdrew funding for the project, citing concerns about how the research might be interpreted or used in modern military contexts. By 2014, Chen had stepped away from academic work entirely. Since then, she has largely stayed out of the public spotlight. And as for the man at the center of the story, Sergeant Thomas Blackwater, very little is known after his departure from military service. If he is still alive today, he would be in his early 40s. The events attributed to him during that week in the Afghan mountains remain unofficial. They don't appear in standard military history books. They aren't celebrated in public ceremonies. Instead, they survive mostly through fragments, after-action summaries, interviews with soldiers, journalistic investigations, and the stories told by people who were there. The idea that someone could use simple objects like stones and terrain to reshape the way sound travels across a battlefield might sound unusual, but historians often point out something important. Throughout history, warriors have always adapted to their environments. Deserts, forests, mountains, urban streets. Every landscape changes the way conflicts unfold. Sometimes the most effective advantage isn't a new weapon, it's simply understanding the terrain better than anyone else. And that leads to an interesting question. What if the real lesson of this story isn't about one sniper or one mysterious operation, but about something much older? For thousands of years, people who lived close to the land learned how landscapes behaved, how wind moved through valleys, how sound bounced between cliffs, how echoes could confuse animals or enemies. Much of that knowledge was passed down quietly through generations. Some of it faded as technology changed the way wars were fought. But occasionally, fragments of that old understanding resurface. And when they do, they remind us that the battlefield is never just about weapons. It's also about perception, awareness, and the environment around us. Officially, the U.S. Department of Defense has never confirmed that an operation exactly matching the Silent Canyon story ever took place, Many of the details remain unverified, but what is known is that intense fighting occurred in several mountain regions of eastern Afghanistan during that time, and soldiers who operated in those areas often described how unpredictable the terrain could be. Steep cliffs, complex echoes, sound traveling in ways that made it hard to locate where shots were coming from. In places like that, confusion can spread quickly, and confusion on a battlefield can be just as powerful as firepower. Today, the valley connected to this story remains largely uninhabited. Local shepherds still graze animals in nearby mountains, but few venture deep into certain narrow canyons. Whether that's due to old battles, dangerous terrain, or simply local folklore, no one can say for sure. But people who have visited those mountains often mention one strange detail. When the wind moves through certain cliffs at night, echoes can bounce between the rocks in unusual ways. A single sound can appear to come from several directions at once, and if you're standing there alone, it can feel unsettling, almost like the landscape itself is answering back. Now, does that mean the mountains are haunted? Of course not. Nature simply has a way of reminding us how little control we truly have over it. But the psychological effect of that environment, especially during conflict, can be incredibly powerful. And that may be the real legacy of the story. Not supernatural forces, not hidden conspiracies, but a reminder that sometimes the most overlooked factor in warfare is the one soldiers are standing on, the ground beneath their feet. So here's something I want to ask you. Have you ever visited a place where the acoustics felt strange? A canyon, tunnel, or valley where sounds echoed in ways that made it hard to tell where they came from? If you have, you probably know how disorienting it can feel. Now imagine experiencing that in the middle of a battlefield. Let me know what you think. Do you believe stories like Silent Canyon are exaggerated over time, or do you think some soldiers really have discovered ways to use terrain and sound that most people never notice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy exploring mysterious military stories, forgotten operations, and the strange psychology of warfare, make sure you stick around, because sometimes the most fascinating parts of history are the ones hidden in the echoes. So after hearing this entire story, one question still hangs in the air. Was Silent Canyon simply an example of brilliant tactical thinking, or did one soldier rediscover something ancient about the way sound and terrain can manipulate human perception? Because history shows us something interesting. For thousands of years, warriors who lived close to the land learned to use their surroundings in ways most outsiders never understood. Echoes, wind, terrain, all of it could become part of the battlefield. And maybe that's the real lesson behind this story. Sometimes the most powerful advantage in war isn't a weapon, it's awareness, understanding the environment better than anyone else. But now I want to hear from you. After everything you've just heard, what do you think really happened in that valley? Do you believe option A, it was purely tactical skill and smart use of terrain? Option B, the story has been exaggerated over time? And option C, something about that valley's acoustics created effects nobody fully understood? Comment A, B, or C below and explain your reasoning. I read the comments on these videos, and the debates on stories like this are always fascinating. And one more thing before you go. If you were that sniper, alone in those mountains for 7 days, do you think you would have made it out mentally the same person? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy mysterious military stories like this, stories where history, psychology, and the battlefield collide, make sure you stick around, because the next story might be even stranger.